Colombetti, and yeah, it's being recorded. So I'm the host for this session today, and it's a great pleasure to introduce our speaker today, because I'm very excited, as I know many of you are, that he has accepted our invitation. And our speaker is Paco Calvo. He is a philosopher of cognitive science at the University of Murcia in Spain, where he is also the director of the MINT lab. And MINT stands for Minimal Intelligence. MINT is a lab that studies the philosophy of plant signaling, plant behavior, and plant neurobiology. And Paco has written extensively on the topics of plant cognition, plant intelligence, plant neurobiology, and even on the question of whether plants have sentience or the capacity to feel, which is really fascinating. So I think, Paco, you are, as I was telling you already, you're really the perfect speaker for Egenis, because we have one research group that is interested in plants and one in cognition. And I am sure you will make us appreciate some exciting connections between the two groups that we could or perhaps should explore further. So I will anyway leave the stage to you now, but just a reminder to our audience too that you will speak for 50 minutes and then we will have time for questions. And I will lead the discussion, remind people on how to raise their virtual hands, but I will do that after your talk. So Paco, is up to you then now. And well, maybe I should announce your title. You're going to talk about Cognitive Science Goes Green, the Quest for Plant Intelligence.
Yeah, thank you, Joanna. Yeah, well, I was telling you before, it's a pleasure to be here. I mean, you were telling me about, the interdisciplinary nature of your group of Egenis, and that's pretty much what we are after. I mean, it's not that we are after it because we like it for the sake of becoming interdisciplinary, but in the case of understanding plant intelligence, we really need to go interdisciplinary, right? So it couldn't work any other way, right? So that's something I was telling you about before, about the different approach or the different perspective, how we try to approach plant life when we look at them from the cognitive sciences and not from the plant sciences themselves, right? So we try to do something that goes beyond the understanding of the type of understanding that we get by pursuing simply plant physiology or molecular and cellular biology. So we need to try a different angle, right? And this different angle is going to pay off to all of us. So the idea is not just that we are going to, it's not just if you see the subtitle about let me see, oops. There you go. So it's not just about the quest of plant intelligence, right? So I would like to think that when we say that cognitive science goes green, I would like to think that the payoff is including a better understanding of ourselves, right? So we can, in a sense, understand human and non-human animal cognition by thinking, nice and easy about what is it that might make plants intelligent, right? So that's the sense in which we would like to think that cognitive science should go green, right? Having a more widespread understanding of intelligence. Now, I always apologize when I put this slide because it's nothing personal. So Patricia Churchan is a great philosopher of neuroscience, and it has nothing to do with her particular approach, more generally speaking. But I found the way she states this like the perfect summary of everything that is wrong, right? So of the whole package that we need to change if we are to understand plant intelligence and the bearing of plant intelligence upon human and animal intelligence more generally, right? So Patricia was saying that if you root yourself in the ground, you can't afford to be stupid, right? So, okay, just picture it. You're grounded, then okay, yeah, you can afford to be stupid. You're not in the movement business. You're not an animal following predator-prey relations. You're just stuck there, doing photosynthesis, and then you cannot be smart. You've got to be dumb, being rooted, right? And just put it this other way. I mean, just think precisely. If you turn it upside down, the argument, just think about how smart you've got to be in the first place to keep passing your genes despite being rooted, right? So it's not that you are stupid because you're rooted and then there's nothing much to be said about what you're doing. No, it's that, hey, I've got to be doing something real bright, real smart, if despite being unable to displace, to move around like an animal does, I'm still passing my genes. So it's just the other way around, right? It's something we are not quite understanding yet, right? In fact, she emphasizes, right? Say, well, if you move, right, you must have the type of mechanisms that ensure that the movement is not simply, it's not just like meaningless movement. Of course, it's got to relate to what matters to you, to the type of contingencies that you need to deal with in your surroundings. So if you move, if you are rooted, you can afford to be stupid. But hey, if you move, something else is happening here, right? And one thing that we know, I mean, this is just hot off the press. We just published this like literally last week. And what we find here, I show you now some time lapse, is that certainly the plants do care about things out there, and those things matter to them, and it's essential that we understand that there's got to be some connection in between those external sources of stimulation, those influences, and the doings of the plant, right? So the only difference is that when we think of plants, we've got to change gear. So it's not movement what counts, or we need to have a different understanding of movement, an interactive, an ecological understanding of movement. It's not the fact that I am moving around, it's the fact that I have to do something to adapt to the surroundings, to keep adapting to the surroundings flexibly, right? So in the case of plants, it's not movement as such, but it's growth and development. And that's why I was telling you before that in a sense, we need to do something different. So if you think of the way plants deal with their surroundings, they cope with uncertainty. They cope with uncertainty by growing in a certain direction. Think of phototropic behavior, or think of gravitropic behavior, following the vector of gravity, or following a source of light, or following a chemical gradient, whatever. So they certainly need to do things with respect to their surroundings. It's simply that they lock onto those sources of information by means of growth and development, and not movement in the way we understand movement from the animal literature, right? So this is in this research where we find that plants are really affected and grow in response to those external sources of stimulation. We need to find a way to appreciate it, right? We don't appreciate it to the naked eye. When you think of an animal, you simply follow the animal doing something. Oh, I saw the mice or the rat or the mouse, the fox, whatever, the eagle. I can track what's going on, what the animal is doing. And it's easier to collect the data in that sense, or to appreciate their doings. In the case of plants, what we have to do is to do time-lapse photography, for example. So here what we do is like we have this setting in the lab. So we take like a top picture and the lateral picture. And this way we are able to see whether there is something that relates the pattern of growth to the target itself, right? So think of a climbing plant that needs to find the support to climb onto, right? So if you think about it, this is what you find, right? So just think, well, you see this little hole here. This little hole is the lateral cam. So this picture, the lateral picture that you get here is the picture that you get here from the side, from this lateral camera. And then from the top camera, this is the picture that you get. So just focus on the top picture, right? So you see how it's trying to get hold of the support. You'll see how it's getting close. You see that? Did you see that? I'm gonna play it again, just there. Yes, okay, just watch there. Did you see that? So, right, now it's nighttime, going to bed, keeps circling around, right? So the plant is, or our working hypothesis, you see that? So it's clearly, I mean, the plant is clear. There are states of affairs in the world that clearly matter to the plant. We just need to change the way we observe their behavior, right? So that's why we said we cannot simply resort to plant physiology, because we are not doing anything about the, of course we can talk physiology, but we care about the behavior as such. Then once you have identified the type of behavior you're interested in, then of course part of the explanation will have to do with unearthing the molecular, the cellular mechanisms, what's happening within the plant. But here we care about the coupling, the actual way the plant interacts with the surroundings. So despite being rooted, and despite not moving in the way animals do, there certainly is growth and development that makes us understand under time-lapse footage. When we observe plants, speeding them up with time-lapse photography, we can certainly understand that there is a pursuit, right? They need, if you are a climber, you need to find the support because you depend on it to hang around and reach out there and do photosynthesis, right? So that's pretty much the approach. So if there is a first take-home message, is that we truly need to put ourselves in their shoes, right? So that's not that easy. We need to understand what is it that matters to them, not what matters to us, right? So that's basically what we do at the Minimal Intelligence Lab. So this is the type of setting which you just saw. These are the booths where we time-lapse the climbing beans, right? And that's the equipment. This is for a different type of experiments. This is Adi, a postdoc in the lab. We do here with time-lapse pea plants also, as well for some other learning paradigms. So we talk about goal-directed behavior. We talk about learning. So we talk about cognitive psychology literature, or the type of phenomenon that we would be interested in from a cognitive perspective, not from a purely physiological perspective, right? And actually, I mentioned time-lapse observations is the easiest way to understand that we have tools at our disposal to try to appreciate what is it that plants are doing. So time-lapse, of course, is the best way to do it. You can take a picture every minute, every 5 minutes, you assemble the footage, and then you see the plant sped up. You see what's happening, how it's trying to get hold of the pole, right? But you can also insert electrodes. You can also insert electrodes and do electrical recordings. So we can record the electrical activity. So the spikes, how plant cells are firing. So when we say they don't have neurons, that doesn't mean we don't care about electrical activity. So electrochemical energy flows are, again, what drives the wheel. It's simply that they don't have neurons, they are rooted, but moving or having neurons is just one of the ways in which nature evolved adaptations to deal with uncertainty and to deal with the contingencies of our surroundings. In their case, they developed other tools, right? But we can still do plant electrophysiology. So think about it. If you combine time-lapse observation with electrophysiological recordings, you have a combined, powerful, very enriching tool of observation. You can be looking within the plant and with the plant with respect to its surroundings, right? So you can see what the plant is doing with the time-lapse footage, and you can see what spikes, what's actually happening within the plant vascular system, right? So let's mention just a few things about, I will move back to those three guys, to climbing beans, to pea plants, and to Venus flytrap, so those three plant models. But just to say something about consciousness, about sentience, before we go back to cognition, to mentality, right? So if you come from different traditions, well, you may have different authors in mind, but one thing is clear. I mean, especially for psychological, philosophical psychology students or psychologists or anthropologists in general, we may all go back to some of the literature in the late 19th century, beginning of the 20th century as well, and connect mentality to life itself. So we might say that to start with, where there is life, there is mind, right? In a sense, I'm not saying that's got to be the case. I'm saying that this is a working hypothesis worth considering and see where that takes us, right? The problem with that, I'm thinking of authors like Arthur Reber, a psychologist. So in this book came out a few years ago, he's discussing one of the positions is what he calls the cellular basis of consciousness idea. Like if you think of awareness as a fundamental property of cellular life itself, right? So a way to put it, if you think away from this anthropocentric or zoocentric perspective, is that you equate sentience with life itself, and that means that you can go literally to the very earliest stages in prokaryotes. So before we move on to different kingdoms, plants and animals, just at this stage, we could be already be talking about sentience or about awareness or about basic mentality, insofar or if it is the case that it connects directly to life as such at the cellular level, right? But here, this is funny, we have a problem, which I don't know why we have some special worry with plants, because we don't quite understand what is it that they are up to. And that's why they say, hey, yeah, if you think of bacteria, if you think of unicellular life more generally, well, if they can locomote according to this approach, the cellular basis of consciousness idea, well, if they can locomote, they already have the foundations of mentality. So the foundations of mentality is already there, insofar as they can locomote. You see what I was saying, that Patricia Churchland point wasn't just her fault, it's everybody's. So it's just like anyone from any different school falls prey of the same misconception. We are obsessed with equating mentality to locomotion. So even if you go so far in time as to the, the basis of the tree of life before these divergences took place, then they say, okay, if you have the capacity to locomote, then you're okay. But plants don't. So the funny thing is that plants being here, up here in this branch in the tree of life, then somehow the idea is that they would need to get rid of it. Why? Because to have mentality, to be sentient, is something that is metabolically expensive, they would say. So it's so expensive, metabolically speaking. You need to, you need to process information via some type of mechanisms. You need to guide movement through some control apparatus. You need to have the ability to monitor those states and make patterns of coordination that are efficient enough. So all this takes energy. All this is metabolically expensive. And if you are not into the movement business, if you are rooted, then we go back to the first slide. We can afford to be stupid, or we can afford not to be sentient. So plants, according to this view, despite sentience being rooted at the very base of the tree of life, they somehow got rid of this basic notion of subjective awareness. They didn't need it because they were rooted, right? So you get to this paradoxical idea that you have unicellular life, which is aware of their surroundings because they can locomote, and then multicellular organisms as rich as plants that suddenly, all of a sudden, they become zombies because they are rooted and they don't need to move. But remember, growth and development is the way they move, the way they behave. So plant behavior take the form of phenotypic plasticity. It's plasticity in their phenotype through growth and cellular differentiation and development that pays off in their case, right? So why should they get rid of basic awareness just because they don't move, if they can still grow and develop in ways which are meaningful with respect to their surroundings, right? So that's a little bit the idea. Now, I said, I just chose this couple of quotes from Arthur Rever and the cellular basis of consciousness idea, but we don't need to buy any of those theories. I mean, you can just pick any other author. So if you think of some of the work by Jablonka, in the case of Jablonka, she actually goes to understanding the emergence of some minimal form of consciousness through the evolution of associative learning, right? So once you have some form of associative learning, then according to them, once you have this capacity to couple different sources of stimulation and provide something that goes well beyond what you obtain when you do, I don't know, habituation or some other primitive form of learning. But once you get to some very sophisticated form of learning, like unlimited associative learning, like you really can generalize by coupling different stimuli, then you are on the road to consciousness, however minimal, right? So that would be in their case the tilting point, right? The borderline in between lack of sentience and genuine minimal consciousness. Now it's funny that when they discuss this, they say, well, then we can move on and understand the distribution of consciousness in the animal kingdom, right? So they don't say, okay, imagine you say, okay, let's equate minimal consciousness to unlimited associative learning, to a sophisticated form of learning. And then you will say, why don't you simply say, okay, let's do that, and then let's discuss the distribution of consciousness in the tree of life. In the tree of life, because organisms, species belonging to kingdoms other than the animal kingdom might exhibit associative learning. So it's not about being an animal, it's about being able to learn by association, right? So that's what counts. But for some reason, we are stuck to this understanding of equating cognition to something that the animal does, right? I won't get into this because we won't have time, but there are some literature which is highly controversial that tries to equate or that tries to throw light upon the possibility of associative learning in plants. This is a pea plant, and in this case, this research by my colleague Monica Galeano, she tried to show that pea plants are able to couple a light source like a blue light, which would be like the food for an animal, with a neutral stimulus like a fan, like providing some airflow, and you could trigger a conditioned response. Once they've coupled the fan to the food for plants, blue light, they will be bending towards the neutral stimulus, expecting that the blue light, the food, will come next, right? So this is associative learning tested in members of kingdoms other than the animal kingdom, right? So if this is the case, then we could rethink what we mean by this, right? If that is the case, we could rethink what we mean by this. There are reasons to think. This is from our lab. Let me just show you. This is a climbing bean, a pea plant. So we have this pea plant growing in this Y maze. This is the type of Y maze that Monica was testing their pea plants in. So they would be presenting the stimuli here, like the blue light and the fan, right? So imagine you have here the blue light, then the fan, the air blow come next. Then you can see whether the plant bends towards the fan or bends away from the fan, right? So this is basically the setting. Now we've been trying to replicate Monica's findings, and we are in the middle of it, so we cannot report any results. But this is highly controversial, right? This is infrared because this is shot at night, so that's why the quality of the picture is like this. This is infrared shooting in dark condition. So, but basically, what we find so far now is reaching the bifurcation where it should move this way or that way. What we find so far is not that promising, which means to say that we might end up finding that these pea plants are not able to learn by association after all. This is an empirical question, and if there are students around, grad students around, I think this is a good lesson for them to take home, which is like we shouldn't be obsessed with defending one result, because this is an open empirical question, I insist. So I don't want to show that plants are able to learn. I want to find out whether they are able to learn. So all we are saying here is that we can customize the protocols from the animal literature to see whether they can throw light upon parallel competencies in the plant kingdom. So plants might be able to learn in a way which, if it's sophisticated enough, then it should deserve this label. So they would fit the bill provided Jablonka's criterion, right? So we have different criteria. You can go back to the cellular basis of consciousness. You can go further up to some form of sophisticated learning, associative learning, unlimited associative learning. Whichever way you go, all we are saying is that, hey, don't exclude on a priori grounds any other organism from any other kingdom just because they are not animals. If they've got to be excluded, it's got to be because of reasons that have to do with what is it that they lack or what is it that they have, what sort of competencies they have, not because they don't match ours. They don't need to match ours. They are in their own kingdom, doing their own business, having their own problems and finding their own solutions. So in fact, if you think about it, they are rooted, but that's not the problem. It's simply that they don't need to go shopping to get their food the way we do. They don't need to locomote. They can do photosynthesis just by reaching out into the sky, right? So they have different problems. They have different solutions. That's the way to go. And if you think about those ways, then we can try to think of criteria for consciousness, which are neutral with respect to kingdoms, right? So we can discuss whether these criteria or other criteria apply to any organism whatsoever belonging to any kingdom whatsoever, right? But not simply to say that they cannot be sentient because they are not animals. No, if they are not sentient, it's because they cannot learn by association, if that is the criterion we agree upon, right? So they keep talking about this, and then they say, well, if this minimal state of consciousness, let's call this is sentience, that's what we've been meaning by sentience, this minimal state of consciousness, let's talk about some basic sense of awareness, some very basic primitive sentience, right? And this includes esteroception, interoception, proprioception. So you have these guys, animals, of course, you have these guys that they have this type of phenomenal experiences, so they can perceive exteroceptically, interoceptically, proprioceptically, right? And they are all animals and they can learn. And then what we find is that plants do all this, right? So of course they actually perceive their surroundings and many other things. So of course we know that roots grow towards gravity, positive geotropistic behavior, shoots grow away from gravity, so away from the gravity pull, that's a negative geotropism, right? So we know all that, and we have an understanding of sedimentation, what sort of organelles are sedimenting within the cell that triggers the signaling that allows them to bend and, you know, grow the way they need to grow. So when you tilt a plant, then those sediments will sediment on the other side, and that will give the cue to the plant to say, hey, we have to bend because we've been tilted, we need to keep growing the other way, right? So they can keep following the vector of gravity if they are roots growing downwards, or if it's shoots growing upwards, they do the same, right? And in fact, what we find is that not only these are roots combining. This is important because they are combining, not just this, in this case, they are growing upwards because they are being contained in this very thin, tubes. But if you combine vertical growth with white light, because roots are photophobic, they grow away from the light. And that's why you see this pattern where they perform this U-turn. They perform this U-turn to grow away from the light. So it's not that plants are sensing this or that type of parameter. It's that they are sensing many environmental signals, and they have to integrate them all. So they have to integrate them all to provide a response that is globally adaptive. So they are not responding to gravity or responding to light or responding to chemicals. They are trying to provide the response that is globally adaptive, provided all the sources of energy impinging on their sensory surface, right? So this is just a handful of a list of different things they are doing, and of course, you know, I won't go through them, but you can see that this is very much more sophisticated than the cartoon version that we have of plants simply, you know, photophobic or phototropic behavior. Okay, I follow the blue light, or I follow the vector of gravity. So they have to respond to all these sources of stimulation, and they have to integrate them all. So it's much, much more sophisticated than we think it is when we think of plants under this cartoon version of them, right? So if you put it this way, now we can move on to cognitive sciences. So to plant cognitive science. So it's easy to equate different systems in between different, human and plant models. So you can easily think of respiratory system and gas exchange system, or digestive or energy assimilation. So you can go one by one and see how they deal with their, how the type of physiological adaptations that have paid off in the case of different organisms. But what's clear, and this takes us to the cognitive sciences, is that the same functions that we find in plants are simply more broadly distributed. So it's about being more centralized or more broadly distributed, because they cannot, it's true that they cannot flee because they are rooted, but precisely because they are rooted, they simply decentralize resources. So nothing becomes essential. They don't have a heart and 2 lungs and 2 kidneys, so they don't need to preserve those organs because they don't have another one. They can decentralize all their activities in such a way that if you chop a branch off, they grow another branch. So it's a different strategy. They are much, much more distributed and decentralized than animals. We like to say that they are less monarchic and more republican, right? So they have a republican distributed nature. So what's important if we take this perspective? Just think of the way you have nutrients and water and solutes moving up and down the plant body, right? So when you think about that, we usually have, from a physiological understanding of the vascular system, you think of the phloem and the xylem pathways as the motorways to transport those sugars, the water, the minerals. But this is the key point. That's what you find if you study plant science. But if you approach plant from the cognitive sciences, you think of this vascular network as an information processing network. So we are talking about the processing of information, not the transport or the translocation of substances, right? So that's what takes us from the physiological to the cognitive perspective, right? So we need to think of them as systems, as organisms that are processing information. This is just a picture of the vascular system of a plant. I won't get into that because I don't want you to say, Giovanna, 5 minutes left, and then me still wanting to talk about 10 more slides. So I'm going to try to speed up. So this is important. Again, another message for grad students. We tend to be really concerned about following the paradigm where we've been educated. So people say, okay, I'm into 4E cognition. Okay, I will only pay attention to 4E cognition. I'm into this other paradigm. I will only pay attention to this other paradigm. What we are saying, well, with plants, we don't want to say, hey, plants are a good reason to pay exclusive attention to one paradigm in the cognitive sciences. No, we can try to think about plant information processing from all the perspectives you can have in cognitive sciences. So if you have a classical, Fodorian understanding of cognition, like a symbol and rule system, right? So if you think that cognition, like in a Fodor style, has to do with the manipulation of symbols according to explicit rules, the way many authors have done that, I'm not saying is the route to follow, is the road to follow, but if you do that, all you need to do is to change the organism you care about. So, for example, some authors, now I'm thinking of Peter Carruthers, he will discuss, the waggle dance of honeybees, and then, how bees are communicating the direction and the source of nectar through the waggle dance. And you might say, yeah, some people understand or try to describe that behavior in terms of rules following. So they deal with symbols and rules, but of course they are not linguistic. They are the type of symbols and rule that honeybees can engage in for the sake of communicating the source of nectar. But all you need to do then is to think of plants in the very same way. So processing information and following rules and symbols, if that is the case. If you are into connectionist theory, some people from the 80s and 90s will remember all the classical disputes in cognitive science between classical symbolic paradigms and neural network theory, connectionist theory. Well, we said that plants are very distributed. This is a neural network, completely distributed real neural network. That's what we find when you look at the vascular system of a plant. If this is the vascular system, just think of all the flow of electrochemical information flowing across the plant body, from root to shoot through the vascular system. So if we are recording, we are making electrophysiological recordings, you can think of the vascular system of the plant as a neural network with all the states, with all the information distributed and superposed throughout the matrix of connection weights of synapses. We don't have synapses in plants because there are no neurons and no synapses. But electrophysiologically speaking, we have the same. We have a vastly interconnected network. So this network is what you will equate with the plant neural network when we apply this perspective. And of course, we can put a lot of emphasis in terms of the environment and the body and the vascular system. So here, if you have an extended understanding of cognition, all you need to do is change nervous system for vascular system. So now we are talking about this vascular system, not the nervous system, but the rest stays in place. So how the vascular system connects to the plant body and how the plant body connects to the environment and to other plants, that now we can understand those other plants as other agents, right? So if you see what I mean, we are not doing anything new. We are applying the same toolkit from the cognitive sciences to new subjects once we've appreciated what is it that they are able to do, right? And of course, if you think of embodied, embedded, extended, or enactive approaches, the 4E, I like to say, by the way, 5E cognition, not 4E, because I like to add ecological psychology, right? It's another E. So embodied, embedded, extended, enactive, and ecological, right? So if we think of 5E cognition, there are many things. I won't say anything right now because you'll see what I mean. I'm going to elaborate on that. But you have other paradigms like really well-fashioned nowadays, like I'm thinking of predictive processing in the way Andy Clark, for example, have been pursuing in the last decade. That's something we've tried to toy with in the past. So we've thought, okay, if that's an approach worth considering, if you could think in terms of predictive processing, which is a way of saying, hey, we don't simply stand out there. The organism doesn't simply stand out there and say, hey, let's see what I received through my sensory periphery. No, I already come equipped with a working hypothesis as to what the world is like. So the plant will be saying, hey, this is my bet. This is what I'm perceiving. This is my top-down prediction of what the world looks like. Then I will get some error from the bottom up. So then from the periphery, I will receiving information from the environment. And then we will be able to negotiate those two sources of information, like the top-down predictions and the bottom-up errors, right? So that you can make use of in order to adjust the type of expectations that you started with. And then the system stabilizes, and that's what we call perception. So if you think of the vascular system of the plant again, and that's a paradigm worth following, if that is the case, then you can make all these predictions. Actually, we did in this paper, we tried that, and we said, okay, we can follow that and make predictions at the domain of the anatomy and the vascular connectivity, and think of those arrangements. So if you have top-down predictions being generated, in the case of humans, we think of deep forward pyramidal cells, right? Those are the deep layers, like throwing down the expectations. And then we have superficial pyramidal cells, which are sending backwards the bottom-up correction errors. So you need some sort of functional asymmetry in between different layers of processing units. We have those processing units in plants. We have those different layers. We have those different arrangements in terms of more deep and more superficial vascular networks within the vascular system of the plant. So again, it's not the way animals do it, but the type of constraints from the anatomy, we can actually make predictions which are functionally similar and which would allow us to keep testing whether the paradigm can be extended to organisms from other kingdoms. We can make predictions about the electrophysiology. We can make predictions that deal with the connection at the psychophysiology, that deal with the connection to, for example, with the very issue of learning. We can be talking about associative learning and thinking of what's got to take place within that type of substrate from a predictive processing approach for learning to take place. So see what I mean? We can keep trying to enlarge those paradigms, any of those paradigms, from the more symbolic and explicit rule following to the more decentralized and less representational and less computational. So there is room for them all to be followed, right? So in fact, that's what we try to think of how you can be more constructivist or more ecological. Here I say ecological, but you can simply say for e-cognition, right? So the same good hold. So we are thinking of the more proximal, the way we directly perceive the surroundings. We think of the behavioral, we put the emphasis on behavior and not on cognition. We think how important it is to be constrained by the level of the implementation without getting obsessed with explicit algorithms or recipe cookbooks. And it's not about following rules, it's about being there and doing the things the way you need to do them, like coupling successfully to your surroundings in a decentralized manner. So all these attributes and all these features that we find that they are enriching and useful when we understand cognition, becoming less obsessed with the neural and with the central nervous system, when we decentralize and outsource cognitive load to the periphery of the system. That's something that has taken some effort to be done in the animal literature. With plants, it comes naturally because there is no central nervous system in the first place. So it comes really natural to do it in the case of plants, right? So now think about it. This is what the petals look like, right? So remember I said we have to make an effort to put ourselves in their shoes to understand what matters to them and not to us, right? So this is a petal. Now what happens when you look at the petal through UV light? This is what you see, right? So this is a petal through UV light. Now why you think, why the petal looks like this through UV light? Well, this is what the whole flower looks like under ultraviolet light. And the reason is no other than we need to think of the design of the plant in terms of patterns of coevolution. So angiosperms, flowering plants, co-evolved with pollinators. So they adapted these designs to attract pollinators. And why? Because these pollinators are these lines that we only see through ultraviolet light is the type of lines that pollinators, insects in this case, do see with their visual apparatus. So they do see these lines, and this provides the type of landmarks that they need to land gently onto the flower and carry their pollen cargo, right? So if you think about it, we need to make the effort to understand what matters to the plant. That's why it makes sense to say, hey, let's see what it looks like under ultraviolet light, because that's the way pollinators will see it. Oh, now we see what's happening. Now they are providing the landmarks for the pollinator to land safe on the petal, right? Now we have a little problem here, is that if you think about it, you can think of the actual optic flow, right? So if you think of this pollinator, the fly in this case, this one now is just flying across the corridor, right? And the key issue is that through movement, now we are going again back to movement. Movement is the critical issue. Through movement, you are generating an understanding of the apparent motion of the surfaces that surround you, right? So that allows you to make the type of turns that you need to make to keep that optic flow being meaningful to the type of interaction you need to be making with your surroundings. So in this case, to stay on track and not bump onto the wall, for example, right? So this optic flow is very informative, and we need to understand it in those ecological terms. This means that we understand movement as the natural way to create a flow, which in turn provides the type of information that will guide further movement, right? So it's this loop, the type of loop that we find meaningful in 4E terms, in terms of embodiment and embeddedness and etc. So all these decentralized approaches say, hey, we couldn't talk of intelligence if there was not movement involved. But now, pay attention. So what's important is that it's not movement per se. It's not movement as such what counts. It's the fact that you can somehow close the loop in between, somehow creating a flow that can be informative in turn. But who said, you see what I mean? So you say, but who said that the way to close that loop and to create that flow that becomes informative in turn needs to be done through movement? Why couldn't it be done through growth? So just, do you see the rationale? So just change movement for growth up here and the same picture holds. So you can grow, and by growing, not by moving, but by growing, you create a flow that in terms provides information that guides further growth, not further movement, but further growth. So you keep growing and growing because that way you are generating the type of energy flows that guide your subsequent growth. That's the coupling that takes place. So you see, now you can talk about intelligence despite being rooted. There is nothing wrong with being rooted. A different issue is that you were not able to create the energy flows that you need to create. But you do create those energy flows. You simply create them through growth and not through movement. You see what I mean? So this way, again, when I say ecological psychology, just say 4E or 5E, right? But literally, now we can understand that the picture or this understanding of intelligence applies to the whole tree of life, literally. So to the 96 phyla contained in the tree of life. So the whole tree of life, remember, it's not that, remember Arthur Weber, it's not that sentience gets started with the tree of life and then plants, because it was metabolically expensive, got rid of it. No, we can all keep using it insofar as we have different means to create the type of energy flows that become informational to us. Could be movement, could be growth, could be whatever. But what matters is that you create those flows, right? So let's see what it looks like in the case of plants. Okay, in the case of plants, 7, 8. In the case of plants, they happen to absorb the blue and the red, okay? So thinking in terms of wavelength, they absorb the blue and the red, and the green and the far red bounces back or goes through. So this means that when you are under full sun, so if a plant doesn't have competency for sunlight, it will have this amount of red, this amount of far red, because there are no other guys absorbing the red. But if there is some other guy in the vicinity, if there is some other guy here, that other guy will absorb the red. So that means that the ratio of red to far red will drop. So if that ratio drops, that means that the plant has a way to know how to move away from the shade. So that triggers a shade avoidance response. So you can trigger a shade avoidance response by growing, because as you grow, you can see whether the ratio of red to far red goes up or down. If by growing in one direction, the ratio goes down, it means I'm getting into somebody's terrain. If by growing in other direction, the ratio goes up, that means I'm growing into full sunlight. So you see, that's the type of information that you generate by growing. You can see how the ratio goes down or up. That's what we were meaning by closing that loop. So this is the way plants close the loop via growth and not movement, right? So let me just show you a more dramatic video of how all this goes. Just check the picture just forget about the lateral view, just focus here on the top view, right? Focus here. So here you see the anti-clockwise movement. Remember, growth is what counts. So this is the pattern of growth. Is growing to reach the support. It's a climber. It needs to find the support. Now I'm cutting it short. It's a long video. We just edited. So you'll see the transition from just a circular movement to fishing. Now is starting to fish towards the pole, right? So it has some way to detect the presence of the pole. Now you see what's going to happen. It's going to fish loop straight. You see, it's going all the way from the back, all the way to the front. So it's skipping the second half of the loop and just going straight for it. You see? Now, this is something you couldn't observe unless you assemble a time-lapse footage. This is the type of data that you couldn't just observe to the naked eye. When you watch it like this is like 72 hours assembled in 2 minutes. So if now you can understand what happened during those 72 hours, how the plant was revolving and growing and generating information in those terms. So Giovanna, let me just, if I may add a few more minutes, just to say something about consciousness. This is, I think that if we think of plants along these lines, I cannot help but thinking about them as locked-in syndrome patients. Like they are fully alive, they are sentient, they have their basic awareness as unicellulars do, as any other one does, right? So if you think of being aware of your surroundings, plants, we know they are certainly aware of their surroundings. I mean, dramatically, they've got to be. And if you think of the levels of arousal, well, I can't help to locate plants around here. But again, we can think of what happens under anesthesia. I mean, plants can be anesthetized, right? So we know what happens with anesthesia. So it's messing up with action potential. It's messing up with the membranes, and it's blocking, actually, effectively, it's blocking the action potential. So it's effectively preventing plant cells from spiking the way animal neurons stop spiking as well. So they don't fire anymore because of this effect of anesthesia, right? So we know that. Actually, we've done that. We've tried these anesthetics, right? We've put a Venus flytrap under anesthesia. This is in the veterinary hospital. So we literally take the plant to the bench where they put animals to sleep. So the same anesthetics, the same molecule, the same type of anesthetics that you use to put a cat, a dog, or a horse to sleep, you can use it to put a Venus flytrap to sleep. And when you do that, this is what you find, right? So this is a Venus flytrap before being anesthetized. So when you trigger the inner hairs, the trap will close, of course. We know they close, right? That's a great adaptation of carnivorous plants. Now, if you put it to sleep, this is under anesthesia. Now you touch the inner hairs, they won't close anymore, you see? It's anesthetized. So now it's not firing, it doesn't fire, and it won't close the trap. And now, once it's come out of anesthesia, you see that you can touch the inner hairs, and now they again go close, if only more slower. So they come out of anesthesia, and they are still sort of like, oh, what happened? Now I can go back to closing my trap, but still kind of, less briskly, still, just coming out of anesthesia, right? So this is interesting because again, relying on different paradigms. Now here we have resorted to IIT. If you're familiar with different theories of consciousness, another theory of consciousness, integrated information theory. If you think in terms of amount of information being integrated as a measurement of consciousness, the more information being integrated, the higher the level of consciousness, right? Not separate modules dealing with different stuff, but amount of integration is what counts. Then we could even actually, this is something we can do in the lab. Actually, we can do an fMRI, you can do a PET scan to a plant. So literally, I mean, you can do all that and track with great accuracy, spatiotemporally, I mean. So combining fMRIs and other scanning techniques. So for example, if you perturb an organism, so through transcranial magnetic stimulation, so if you do TMS to a human or any other animal, you can see how that perturbation affects the degree of integration of information. So how then you can assess the level of consciousness of that form of life, right? So we might say, hey, if subjective awareness arises from interactions between the parts, if it's the integrating of the information what counts for a system to be aware, then we could even perturb with these techniques plant vascular systems and see how we can break apart those vascular information pathways and see how much information remains integrated or not. So in a sense, what I'm saying is that the very same way we can assess consciousness in animals, again, we can use it to assess sentience in plants, because the principles should hold regardless of the kingdom that we are studying in the tree of life. And sorry for being late. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, okay, sorry, we can't make you hear our noise, but I'm sure everyone is clapping. And yeah, great. I mean, it's fascinating. I do have so many questions. Oop, I have many questions.